Chapter 77.
It seemed to July that he was nearly as cursed as Job when it came to catching Elmira. Despite his caution, he kept having accidents and setbacks of a kind that had never happened at home in Fort Smith. 3 days out of Dodge, the new horse he had bought, which turned out to be not so well broken in, fell and crippled himself trying to throw a hobble. July waited a day hoping it wasn't as bad as he thought it was, but the next day he saw it was even worse. It hardly seemed possible to lose 2 horses on one trip when he had never lost a horse before in his life. But it was a fact he had to face. With that fact went another. He wasn't likely to get another horse until he went back to Dodge. North of him there was only the plains until he came to the Platte River, a long walk. July hated to double back on himself, but he had no choice. It was as if Dodge City had some kind of magnet, letting him go and then sucking him back. He shot the second horse just as he had done the first one, hit his saddle, and went back. He walked grimly, trying to keep his mind off the fact that Ellie was getting farther and farther away all the time. He swam the Arkansas River when he came to it, walked in town with wet clothes, bought another horse, and left again within the hour. The horse trader was half drunk and eager to bargain, but July cut him short. "You ain't getting anywhere fast, are you, young feller?" the old man said, chuckling. July thought it was an unnecessary comment. He went right back across the river. All during the trip he had been haunted by the memory of something that had happened in Fort Smith several years before. One of the nicest men in town, a cotton merchant, had gone to Memphis on a business trip only to have his wife take sick while he was gone. They tried to send a telegram to notify the man, but he was on his way back, and the telegram never got delivered. The man's name was John Fisher. As he rode back to Fort Smith, John Fisher saw a burying party out behind the church. Being a neighborly man, he had ridden over to see who had died, and the people all stopped, stricken, for they were burying his wife. July had been helping to cover the coffin. He never forgot the look on John Fisher's face when he realized he was a day late. His wife had died the afternoon before his return. Though a healthy man, John Fisher only lived another year himself. If he ran into someone on the street who had seen his wife on her sick bed, he always asked, "Do you think Jane might have lived if I'd gotten back sooner?" Everyone told him no. You couldn't have done a thing, but John Fisher didn't believe them. July had no reason to think that Elmira was sick, but he had so much worry that he hated every delay. Fortunately, the horse was strong, a good traveler. July pushed him hard, taking his own rest when he felt the horse needed it. He watched the horse closely, knowing that he couldn't afford to lose him. He only had $2 left, plus some coffee, bacon, and his rifle. He hoped to kill an antelope, but never could hit one. Mostly he lived on bacon. Near the Republican River, he had a second piece of bad luck. He had camped on a little bluff, exhausted, and after hobbling the horse, he fell asleep like a stone. He didn't sleep well. In the night, he felt a stinging in his leg, but it was too heavy with sleep to care. Red ants had gotten him several times. When he awoke, it was to severe pain and a right leg so swollen that he had to cut his pants open to see what was wrong. When he did, he saw fang marks, just above the knee. A snake must have crawled near him in the night, and in his thrashing he had turned over and scared it. He had heard no rattle, but it might have been a young snake, or had its rattle broken off. At first he was very scared. He had been bitten in the night. The poison had had several hours in which to work. It was already too late to cut the bite and try to drain the poison. He had no medicines and could do nothing for himself. He grew lightheaded and assumed he was dying. From the bluff he could see far north across the Republican, almost to Nebraska, he supposed. It was terribly bad luck to be snake-bit almost in sight of where he needed to be. He didn't even have much water, for the river was so close he had let himself run low. There was no shade on the bluff. He covered his face with his hat and lay back against his saddle, sweating and ashamed of his own carelessness. He grew delirious, and in his delirium would have long talks with Roscoe. He could see Roscoe's face plain as day. Roscoe didn't seem to blame him for the fact that he was dead. If he himself was soon going to be dead too, it might not matter so much. July didn't die. His leg felt terrible, though. In the night came a rainstorm, and he could do nothing but huddle under the saddle blanket. His teeth began to chatter, and he couldn't stop them. He almost wished he could go on and die. It was so uncomfortable. But in the morning the sun was hot. He soon dried out. He felt weak, but he didn't feel as if he were dying. Mainly he had to avoid looking at his leg. It looked so bad he didn't know what to think. If a doctor saw it, he would probably cut it off and be done with it. When he tried to bend it even a little, a terrible pain shot through him. Yet he had to get down to the river or else die of thirst, even though it had just rained. He had been too sick to try to catch any of the rainwater. That afternoon he stood up, but he couldn't touch his right foot to the ground. He managed to belly over the horse and get down to the river. It was 3 days before he had the strength to go back and get in the saddle. The effort of getting to the river had exhausted him so much he could barely undo a button. Early one morning he shot a large crane with his pistol, and the meat put little strength in him. His leg had not been returned to normal, but it had not fallen off either. He could put a little weight on it, but not much. 5 days after the snake bit him, July saddled up and rode across the Republican River. Since leaving Dodge, he had not seen one person. He worried about Indians. Wounded as he was, he would have been easy prey, and yet he grew so lonesome that he would have been glad to see an Indian or two. He began to wonder if there were any people at all in the north. As he neared Nebraska, the plains took on a browner look. Though he was fairly sure now he wasn't going to die, he kept having spells of lightheadedness in which his vision wavered and he tended to run off at the mouth. At night, he would wake and find himself in the middle of a conversation with Roscoe. It embarrassed him, though no one was around to hear. But he kept on. Streams became a little more plentiful, and he ceased to worry too much about water. Once he thought he saw riders far in the distance, but when he went toward them, they turned out to be 2 buffaloes standing on the prairie as if they were lost. July started to shoot one, but it was more meat than he needed, and if he killed one, the other buffalo would be as alone as he was. He passed on, and that night killed a big prairie chicken with a rock. 3 days later, he saw the Platte, winding between 2 brown slopes. He soon hit a good wagon track, followed it west. About noon, he saw a lone frame house standing a half-mile south of the Platte. There were corrals and a few sheds near it, and a sizable horse herd grazing inside of the house. July felt like crying. It meant he wasn't lost anymore. No one would build a frame house unless there was a town somewhere near. Being alone on the prairie for so many weeks had made him realize how much he liked being in towns, though when he thought about all that he had been through, he didn't feel like he had much hope of finding Ellie there. How could a woman come across such distances? As he approached the house, an old man appeared north, riding out of the Platte, his horse dripping water. July saw there were more horses north of the river. The old man had white hair and seemed to be a Mexican. He rode with a rifle held lightly across his saddle. July didn't want to appear unfriendly. He stopped to wait. The old man looked mainly at his leg. July had forgotten how ugly it looked. He had even forgot it was still yellowish and almost bare, for he had cut his pants leg off when the leg was so swollen. "Is it bad?" the old man asked in English. July was glad for the English. "Not as bad as it was," July said. "Is Ogallala near here?" 20 miles, the old man said. "I'm Cholo. Come to the house. You must be hungry." July didn't argue. He had almost forgotten that people sat at tables in houses to eat. He had lived so long on half-cooked bacon or half-cooked game that he had become shy at the thought of sitting at a proper table. He didn't look proper, he knew. As he approached the house, he suddenly heard shrieks of laughter, and a little girl flew around the corner of the house. Another slightly older girl in hot pursuit. The girl in the lead ran onto one of the sheds between the house and the corral and tried to hide in it, but her sister caught her before she could get inside, and they tussled and shrieked. The older girl was trying to put something down the younger girl's neck, and she finally succeeded, at which point the younger girl began to hop up and down, while the older one ran off laughing. As the two men rode up, a woman appeared on the back steps of the house. She wore a gray smock and an apron and had an infant in her arms. She was clearly out of temper, for she yelled something at the two girls, who stopped their shrieking, looked at one another, and slowly approached the house. The infant the woman held was crying fretfully, though, at that, making less noise than the girls. The woman addressed herself to the older girl, who made some excuse, and the younger girl, in her own defense, pointed back toward the shed. The woman listened a minute, began to talk rapidly, giving her daughters what for, July supposed. To see a woman so suddenly, after so much time alone, made him very nervous, particularly since the woman was out of temper. But as they drew closer, he found that, out of temper or not, he couldn't stop looking at her. Her eyes flashed as she lectured her daughters, neither of whom was taking the lecture silently. Both are trying to talk back, but the mother didn't pause to listen. She had abundant brown hair tucked into a bun at the back of her head, though the bun had partly come loose. The old Mexican seemed not the least bit disturbed by the argument in progress. In fact, he seemed amused by it, and he rode up and got off his horse as if nothing were happening. "But she put a grasshopper down my neck," the younger girl said. "I hate her." "I don't care who hates who," the woman said. "I was up with this baby all night. You know how colicky he is. You don't have to scream right under my window. Looks like there be room on this prairie for you to scream without doing it under my window. All we got out here is room." "It was a grasshopper," the little girl insisted. "Well, is it the first one you ever seen?" the woman asked. "You'll have more to worry about than a grasshopper if you wake this baby again." The woman was rather thin, but anger put color in her cheeks. The girls finally were subdued, and the woman looked up and saw him, lifting her chin with a bit of belligerence, as though she might have to tie into him too. Then she saw his discolored leg, and her look changed. She had gray eyes, and she turned them on him with sudden gravity. "Get down, senor," the old man said. The girls looked around and became aware for the first time that the stranger had come. They instantly stopped fidgeting and stood like statues. The woman smiled. She seemed to have switched from anger to amusement. "Hello, I'm Clara," she said. "Pardon the commotion, we're a loud bunch. Get down, sir, you're welcome." July had not spoken in so long, except for a few words he had spoken to Cholo and his ravings to Roscoe Brown, that his voice came out cracked. "Thank you. I wouldn't want to trouble you," he said. Clara laughed. "You don't look strong enough to trouble nobody around here," she said. "We grow our own troubles. It would be a novelty to have some we ain't already used to. These are my daughters, Sally and Betsy." July nodded to the girls and got off his horse. After a ride, his legs stiffened, and he had to hobble over to the porch. The baby was still fretting. The woman rocked it in her arms as she watched July hobble. "Snakebit him," Cholo observed. "I guess I rolled into it at night," July said. "Never even seen it. Just woke up with a yellow leg." "Well, if you've lived this long, I expect you have nothing to fear," Clara said. "We'll get some food in you. The way sick people have been turning up lately, I sometimes think we ought to go out of the horse business and open a hospital. Come on, in the house. You girls set him a place." The old man helped him up the steps and into the roomy kitchen. Clara was poking the fire in the cook stove, the baby still held in one arm. "If you'd like to wash first, I'll have the girls draw some water," Clara said. "I didn't get your name." "I'm July Johnson," July said. "I come from Arkansas." Clara almost dropped her poker. The girls had told her the little scar-faced man had said the woman they were with was married to a sheriff named Johnson from Arkansas. She hadn't given the story much credence. The woman didn't strike her as the marrying type. Besides, the little man had whispered something to the effect that the big buffalo hunter considered himself married to her. The girls thought it was mighty exciting having a woman in the house who was married to two men. And if that wasn't complicated enough, the woman herself claimed to be married to D. Boot, the gunfighter they had hung last week. Cholo had been in town when the hanging took place and reported that the hanging had gone smoothly. Clara looked more closely at the man standing in her kitchen. He was very thin and in a kind of daze. Probably couldn't believe he was still alive after such a journey. She had felt that way herself upon arriving in Ogallala after her trip over the plains with Bob, and she hadn't been snakebit or had any particular adventures. But if he was married to the woman, the baby drooling on her bosom might be his. Clara felt a flash of annoyance, most of it with herself. She had already grown attached to the baby. She liked to lie in bed with him and watch him try to work his tiny hands. He would peer at her for long stretches, frowning as if trying to figure her life out. But when Clara laughed at him and gave him her finger to hold, he would stop frowning and gurgle happily. Apart from the colic, he seemed to be a healthy baby. She knew the mother was probably still in Ogallala and that she ought to take the child into town and see if the woman had had a change of heart and wanted her son, but kept putting it off. It would be discouraging to have to give him up, she told herself. If the mother didn't want him bad enough to come and get him, then the mother was too foolish to have him. She reminded herself it was time that she got out of the habit of babies. She wouldn't be likely to get any more, and she knew that she ought to figure out another way to keep herself amused, but she did like babies. Few things were as likely to cheer her up. She had never seriously supposed a father would turn up, and yet only 3 weeks had passed and one had, standing in her kitchen, dirty, tired, and with a badly discolored leg. Clara poked the fire a time or two more, trying to adjust to the surprise. Then she turned and looked at July. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "are you looking for your wife by any chance?" July almost fell over from surprise. "Yes, her name is Elmira," he said. "How'd you ever know?" He began to tremble. Clara came over, took his arm, and led him to a chair. The girls were standing in the doorway watching every move. "I've been looking for Ellie all the way," July said. "I didn't even know she come this way. She's not a large woman. I was afraid she might have died. Have you seen her?" "Yes," said Clara. "She stopped here for the night about 3 weeks ago in the company of 2 buffalo hunters." To July it seemed too much of a miracle that, with the whole plains to cross, he and Ellie would strike the same house. The woman, who was watching him intently, seemed to read his mind. "We get a lot of travelers," she said, as though he hadn't spoken. "Situating this place right here was one of the smartest things my husband ever did. Anyone coming along the Platte, we're on the only road. If we hadn't located on this road, we'd have been starved out long ago." "It seems," July said, and he couldn't finish. It was all he had hoped for, to be able to find her someday. He had risked and lost 3 lives to do it, and though Ellie wasn't right there, surely she was in town. He began to tremble and then to cry. He couldn't help it. His hopes were to be answered after all. Silently, Clara handed him a rough dish towel. She scowled fearlessly at the girls until they backed off. She followed them out the back door to give the man a moment to collect himself. "Why is he crying?" Betsy asked. "He's just unnerved. He's come a long way, and I imagine he had stopped expecting to make it," Clara said. "But he's a man," Sally said. Their father had never cried as far as she knew. "Men have tears in them too, same as you," Clara said. "Go draw some water. I think we might offer him a bath." She went back in, and July had not quite gained control of himself. He was too shaken with relief. The baby, now in a good mood, was mouthing its own fingers and rolling its eyes up to her. Might as well tell the man, she thought. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "Mr. Johnson, I guess I've got another piece of news for you," Clara said. She looked from the baby's face to his, seeking resemblances. It seemed to her the foreheads were the same, and though the child had little hair, the little was the same color as July's. He was not a bad-looking man, just gaunt from his travels and dirty. She had a notion to make him shave when he was rested, so she could compare the face with the baby's. He could use Bob's razor. 1 week ago she had stropped it and shaved Bob. July looked at her as she fiddled with the baby. The tears had left him feeling empty, but his gratitude to the woman just for being there and treating him kindly was so great that he felt he might cry again if he tried to speak. The woman seemed too beautiful and too kind to be true. It was clear she was older. She had fine wrinkles around her mouth, but her skin was still soft, and her face, as she wriggled the baby's little hand with one finger, was beautiful. The thought of more news troubled him a little, though probably one of Elmira's companions had stolen something or made some mischief. If that woman was your wife, I guess this child is yours, Clara said. She had it the night she was here. Then she left. She was very anxious to get to town. I don't believe she realized what a fine boy she had. We all took to him right away around this place. July had not really looked at the baby. He had supposed it belonged to Clara. She had said her name was Clara. She was watching him closely with her kind gray eyes, but what she said seemed so unlikely that he couldn't really credit it. Elmira had said nothing to him about wanting a baby or planning to have one or anything. To him, so tired he could hardly sit straight, it just meant another mystery. Maybe explained why Elmira ran away, though it didn't to him. As for the little boy, wiggling in Clara's lap, he didn't know what to think. The notion that he would have a son was too big a notion. His mind wouldn't really approach it. The thought made him feel lost again, as he had felt out on the plains. Clara saw that he was past dealing with it for the moment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," she said, immediately getting up. "I should be cooking instead of worrying you about things you're too tired to deal with. You eat and go rest. This boy will still be here. We can discuss this tomorrow." July didn't answer, but he felt he was remiss. Not only was Clara going to a lot of trouble to feed him, she was taking care of a baby that might be his. He tried to think of things he might do or say, but nothing came to mind. Clara went cheerfully about the cooking, holding the baby in her arms most of the time, but occasionally plucking him down on the table for a minute if she needed both hands for the work. "Just catch him if he starts to roll," she said. "That's all I ask." She fed July beefsteak and potatoes and peas. July felt he would be too tired to eat, and yet at the smell of the food, his appetite returned and he ate every bite. "I made Bob build me a windbreak," she said. "I watched my gardens blow away for 10 or 12 years, and I finally got tired of it." July looked at her questioningly. "Bob's my husband," she said. "He's injured. We don't hold out too much hope for him." She had strained and heated a little milk, and while July ate, she fed the baby using a big nipple she had fixed to a fruit jar. "We use this nipple for the colts," she said. "Sometimes the mares don't have their milk at first. It's a good thing that boy's got a big mouth." The child was sucking greedily at the nipple, which was quite large, it seemed to July. "I've been calling him Martin," Clara said. "Since he's yours, you may want to change it. I think Martin is a nice name for a man. A man named Martin could be a judge or maybe go into politics. My girls fancy the name, too." "I don't guess he's mine," July said. "Ellie never mentioned anything about it." Clara laughed. It surprised him. "Had you been married long?" she asked. "About 6 months," July said, when she left. "Oh, well. You were newlyweds then," Clara said. "She might have been put out with you and decided not to tell you." "She had another boy, Joe," July said. "He went with me when I went after Jake Spoon, only Joe got killed on the plains. Ellie don't know it yet." "Did you say Jake Spoon?" Clara said. "I know Jake. We courted once. I saw him in Ogallala about a year ago, but the woman he was with didn't like my looks, so we didn't talk much. Why were you after Jake?" July could barely remember it all. It seemed to have happened so long ago. "Jake was gambling and a fight got started," he said. "Jake shot off a buffalo gun and the bullet went through the wall and killed my brother. I was out of town at the time. Peach, my sister-in-law, wanted me to go after Jake. I wish now I hadn't." "Well, it sounds accidental to me," Clara said, "though I know that's no consolation to your family. Jake was no killer." "Well, I didn't catch him anyway," July said. "Elmira ran off and Roscoe come and told me. Now Roscoe's dead too. I don't guess it could be my baby." Clara was still studying the two faces, the little one and the gaunt, tired one. It interested her, what came across from parent to child. "When did your wife run off?" she asked. "Oh, it's been over 4 months," July said. "A long time. Clara chuckled. Mr. Johnson, I don't think arithmetic's your strong suit, she said. I think this is young Mr. Johnson you're looking at. I had that figured out even without the dates, but the dates jibe pretty well. July didn't know what to say. Clara seemed delighted with her conclusion, but he didn't feel anything at all. It was just a puzzle. I guess I'm awful, Clara said. Any kind of company affects me this way. I shouldn't be bothering you when you're so tired. The girls are drawing water. You have a bath. You can sleep in their room. It's a good bed. Later, when he got bathed and had fallen into a sleep so deep that he didn't even turn over for several hours, Clara brought the baby in and peeked at July. He hadn't shaved, but at least he had washed. Cleaned of the dirt, he looked very young, only a few years older than her oldest boy would have been had he lived. Then she went back to look at Bob for a moment. An ugly ooze had been seeping onto his pillow. The stitches in his head had been removed, but underneath the wound seemed hot. It might be a new infection. Clara cleaned it the best she could and took the baby out on their little porch. Well, Martin, your pa showed up, she said, grinning at the baby. It's a good thing we got a house right on the road. I wonder what your pa will think of us when he gets his wits together. The baby waved a hand in the warm air. Down at the lots, the girls were watching Cholo work with a 2-year-old filly. Clara looked at the baby and offered it her finger. We don't much care what your pa thinks of us, do we, Martin? She said. We already know what we think of him.
Yep.